The book of Hebrews is hard to grasp for many, but it's actually not that hard to understand once we know what the main theme of the letter is and the context in which it was written. The book of Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians who, because of persecution, were tempted to compromise with their faith to once again be accepted and included in the Jewish society. The temptation was to reject their faith in Jesus and turn back to the law of Moses, instead of trusting in Jesus alone for their salvation. The writer of Hebrews, and we don't know for sure whether it was Paul or someone else, is like a lawyer before the court, vehemently defending the new covenant and salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, as opposed to salvation by the law, that is our own performance. The book of Hebrews is all about contrasts. Again and again, the author points out how much better the new covenant is compared to the old. The author starts by saying that God used to speak through his prophets, but now he has spoken through his own Son, who is the perfect representation and image of God. He's basically saying the prophets of the old covenant were great, but Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, is greater. He goes on to say that the law of Moses was given to man by angels, but Jesus, who came with the new covenant, is greater than all the angels. Moses, who received the law, was a trusted servant of God, but Jesus is not only God's servant, but God's Son. Therefore, the Son Jesus and the new covenant is greater than the servant Moses and the old covenant. After that, the author moves on to talk about the priesthood of the old versus the new covenant. The Levitical priesthood of the old covenant had shortcomings because the priests did not only have to offer repeated gifts and sacrifices for the sins of the people, but also for themselves. Jesus, on the other hand, is a high priest from a greater lineage after the order of Melchizedek. Jesus, being God's Son, was without sin and therefore did not have to offer sacrifices on his own behalf. By the sacrifice of himself at the cross, Jesus once and for all took away the sins of the world, and thus animal sacrifices are no longer necessary. Since Jesus introduced a new priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, he also introduced a new law, a new and better covenant based on God's grace, which has replaced the law of Moses of the Old Covenant. How are we to understand the book of Hebrews? It's simply a book written to show us that the new covenant is greater than the old covenant, and that the old covenant has expired, and that we are to stick with the new covenant only. This does not mean that we should not read the Old Testament anymore, but what it means is that we need to filter everything we read in the Old Testament through the finished work of Jesus. The Old Testament is actually a book about Jesus, because Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So start reading the book of Hebrews with this knowledge, and you will understand it and the new covenant like never before.